Today, I want to touch briefly on a recent AI paper, and then I'm going to use it as a springboard to go on a rant about the intersection of technology and current events. Fair warning, I'm going to be spending some time putting the current American societal situation in some historical and technological context. And if you're looking for a video that won't challenge your existing beliefs, you should move on. I don't care which side of the political divide your online information bubble is sitting in, that bubble is almost certainly floating in a sea of bovine excrement, and this video is going to offend you. Now, if that sounds like I'm setting up an ad read for some app that talks about improving your news diet, I'm not, because apps like that won't really help. If you really want to understand what's going on now, you need to, horror of horrors, read a book. Pretty sure I'm going to lose some subscribers over this one, so what the fuck. This is the Internet of Bugs. My name is Carl. I've been in the software profession since the 1980s, and I'm trying to make the internet a less buggy and all-around safer place. This is from a recent paper from chatbot skeptic Gary Marcus, who I often agree with, called, quote, AI bot swarms threaten to undermine democracy. And while this paper does have citations to some really interesting research that I'm going to be poring over for some time, and while this paper also is correct that AI is a very powerful tool to manipulate people, my overwhelming reaction upon seeing this paper was, where the fuck have you all been? Threatened to undermine democracy? Are you kidding me? Have you been living under a rock? America's democracy has been undermined for a long, long time. Honest people can argue about precisely when it started, but I don't think it's possible or necessary to pick an exact point in time. Something like a third of Americans think that the 2020 presidential election was illegitimate. 72% think January 6th was an attack on democracy. Only 6% of Americans believe that the Justice Department is following the law with respect to the releasing of the files related to a now-deceased convicted human trafficker. And if you add up the Americans believing the Supreme Court was wrong when it legalized abortions, and the Americans believing the Supreme Court was wrong when it made them illegal again, you get a fair approximation of everybody. I'd argue that between all of those and a bunch of other controversial issues, that the vast majority of Americans believe that democracy has failed in at least some cases. And I'm absolutely one of those people. For example, I believe that law enforcement officers should never be allowed to hide their identities. I believe that filming the police is and should always be legal, and that any law enforcement officer who shoots and kills a person that is not directly threatening immediate harm to themselves or other persons is guilty of a crime and should be prosecuted. I think that what the Republicans are currently doing with ICE is absolutely illegal and should be stopped, and that what the Democrats are doing is encouraging it because they think it's their best chance to win the next election. That said, if you think this is unprecedented, the way most of anti-MAGA internet bubbles keep saying, you haven't been paying attention. But I'll come back to that. First, though, I want to talk about a more foundational lie that Americans, like me, were taught in school from a young age. The lie that the American Constitution makes sense, that the checks and balances in it are effective, and that the people who wrote it did a good job. Depending on how you phrase the question, something like 70 to 95% of Americans have a favorable view of the Constitution. I'd argue the Constitution is fundamentally flawed, and the people creating it knew it and just pretended otherwise. And I'm not talking about the contradiction between all men being equal and the disenfranchisement of African Americans, although that was horrific and it will be a stain on America forever. If you read the writings of the Founding Fathers discussing the Constitution, you'll find a lot of concerns about what they called factions, what we've come to know as political parties. Federalist 9, written by Hamilton, and Federalist 10, written by Madison, and Federalist 51, was written probably by one or the other, and they all made assertions about how the checks and balances of the Constitution would protect the Union from factions. This, of course, didn't happen. The famed checks and balances of the American experiment have been trumped, pun intended, by officials being more loyal to their parties than to the Constitution or the people virtually since the inception of the Republic. The purpose of the Federalist Papers in the first place was to promote the arguments of the Federalist faction and counteract the arguments of the Anti-Federalist faction. And it's not like this was a new concept. The tendency of people to form factions was described by Plato in ancient Greece. And factions were something the founders were all familiar with. There were active parties in the English Parliament before, during, and after the American Revolution. And within a decade of the ratification of the Constitution, Hamilton and Madison had each joined opposing factions that were warring for control of the fledgling republic. It was obvious to all of them at the time that factions were becoming a problem, and they found themselves having to create the 12th Amendment to the Constitution to address the problems inherent in having a president of one party and a vice president of an opposing party. Here was ample opportunity to try to further address the obvious failure of the Constitution to, as was asserted in the Federalist Papers, use checks and balances as a safeguard against domestic factions. And yet the drafters did nothing of the sort. And I've watched this failure getting worse and worse my entire life. I really became aware of people putting party over country with the big government shutdown in the mid-1990s. It has escalated pretty consistently ever since. with the exception of immediately after September 11, 2001, when a brief period of unity resulted in wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, extinguishing hundreds of thousands of human lives, including at least 10,000 Americans, more than 3 times the casualties from 9/11. But despite the last couple of minutes, this channel isn't about politics. I'm here to talk about technology, and although the internet did exist in the run-up to the mid-90s, it hadn't yet become widespread enough to impact society. The primary tech fueling the rise in partisanship was actually call-in talk radio, believe it or not, enabled by improvements in the software switching of long-distance telephone calls, along with the breakup of AT&T in 1984 and the removal of the FCC Fairness Doctrine in 1987. Most of you probably can't imagine that would be a big deal, but I assure you it was. And in many ways, it was a primitive precursor to more recent social media information bubbles. Just instead of doom scrolling for hours, reading people trying to make you furious and partisan, people doom listened for hours to people trying to make them furious and partisan. And as the information bubbles have gotten more sophisticated technologically, the partisanship has only gotten worse. I said earlier that trying to control your news diet doesn't help. And that's because the current landscape is made up of various outlets and influencers, each cherry-picking the current events that best support their audience's existing biases and presenting them in their most inflammatory way they know how. Consuming propaganda from both the left and the right is slightly better than only consuming either one in isolation, but it's still just propaganda and you're still missing out on any useful context. For example, the government currently has masked agents grabbing people off the streets. This is horrific and should definitely be stopped, and the people doing it should be held accountable. But despite what I've seen people claim over and over in left-wing bubbles, this isn't unprecedented. Here is a picture of a bunch of masked thugs in their official government capacities snatching a man off the street in broad daylight. But this isn't recent. It was back in 2014 during the Obama administration in Ferguson, Missouri. It's not okay now, and it shouldn't have been okay back then either. The government, at the time I'm writing this, has also just arrested an African-American journalist for the crime of being a journalist. This time it's Don Lemon, formerly of CNN. In 2014, it was Wes Lowery of the Washington Post. Again, this is horrific, and we should all object. And the same was true in 2014. I could go through a laundry list of other precursors, like the similarities between the removal of the president of Venezuela and the removal of the leaders of Grenada, Panama, and Haiti under Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, respectively. But hopefully you get the point by now. The scale is bigger now, and the government is more authoritarian now. But the scale gets bigger every time, and the government gets more authoritarian every time. This is just a progression, not something this administration just started. That's not to excuse it, it's inexcusable. But the narrative that this is just a thing that the current administration does is just not true, which means that the idea that if the other team gets elected, democracy will be saved is just a lie. I'm not saying that both sides are equal. That's clearly not true. But given that our choices are limited to cruelty and cowardice from the right, and complicity and incompetence from the left, and gaslighting and propaganda from everywhere, what part of the democracy still exists to be threatened, to be undermined by AI exactly? We have largely gotten to the point where, no matter who is in charge, Congress refuses to legislate, and, aside from whatever crap gets tacked onto the appropriation bills, pretty much any impact the government has on people's lives come either via presidential fiat or Supreme Court capriciousness. And the whole ecosystem exists to get each of us to pick a team and spend all of our time arguing over every little detail of every little news report so that we don't have time or energy to demand any actual change. I have a slim hope, believe it or not, that the revulsion and disgust people are starting to feel for AI slop might actually allow us a way out of this mess. As the media environment becomes more and more saturated with meaningless performative slop being pushed on us against our wills, a backlash is forming, and some people are starting to seek out truth and authenticity. And if enough people do that, we may just have enough critical mass to make some real lasting changes for once. And so, if you've managed to watch this far, I beg you, hate on AI slop as much and as often and as loudly as you can. If we try hard enough and get lucky enough that enough people start rejecting the slop, AI might just improve all of our lives after all, just not in the way that its makers intended, desired, or hoped to profit from. Thanks so much for listening to me rant. Until next time, let's be careful out there.